So hello everybody to this third session of our webinar on how to build anti-corruption evidence-based strategies using the resources from our website, but also other additional resources and data that you can collect yourselves. Today we move to the right-hand side of the balance, the constraints to control of corruption. Now, if you listened to me before, you understood by now that this balance cannot be really considered as separate elements. It is an interaction between all these parts of the balance which really leads to the equilibrium, leads to the moment where in fact the level of constraints offset the level of resources for corruption, and therefore you manage to prevent corruption. Prevention of corruption is our essential goal. Only societies which have already reached control of corruption can afford to think of just repressing corruption. Because if corruption is an exception, you are going to be able to repress it. You will be able to have effective law enforcement agencies. You will be able to have an impartial judiciary, but if in fact control of corruption have never been reached, and this is why we are discussing in this context, we are discussing this really historical hurdle of building for the first time an accountable, free of corruption, largely free of corruption government. And if you are in this second situation, then you have to stop corruption from happening, because corruption is the norm. You cannot repress it. There is nobody to repress it. Everyone is a part of it. So what we have to do is to prevent the corrupt acts from happening. And this, of course, is really a historical challenge, but there are countries who have managed it. And since others have managed it, we are really encouraged to do that. Now I'm going to try to share my screen if moderator allows me, in order to show just a few charts. I could really tell you only stories today, but what I'm going to do is also show some evidence, since we are the evidence-based center. That is really quite important that you see some evidence. Right, so you recall that the constraints for corruption were basically of two types. One are the constraints of corruption put by the existence of an autonomous from government judiciary or other type of what we call horizontal accountability agency, of some controllers who are able to put a stop to the government, to check the government, but in the same time, they do not really have a common background with the government. You know, in corrupt countries, for instance, even if you have all the formal constitutional guarantees of judicial independence, in fact, what happens very much is the judiciary is under the influence of government, or in many ways, they belong to the same class. Right? In Italy, for instance, there was evidence before their big Clean Hands campaign. There were evidence that, you know, the same people who belong to the same elite groups decided who is going to go in the Supreme Court, who is going to go in Parliament, who is going to go to the boards of big corporations. And due to this very fused elite structure, there was no real separation. You know, so despite having quite constitutional guarantees of the judiciary, despite having, for instance, a judicial council, because Italy is the first historical country where in fact the judiciary was autonomously self-ruled by constitution. And this was introduced at the end of the Second World War, actually at the suggestion of Americans, in order to help Italy clean its judiciary from fascism. And this is the model that we now have in most of our countries which have problems with corruption. In particular, in East European countries and in Latin American countries, we try to regulate our judiciary through its self-ruling body, the Judicial Council, based on this Italian model. But despite the fact that on paper it is the Judicial Council which rules the judiciary, what happens more often than not in practice is that roughly it is the same elite which controls all these appointments. So this is not just a simple matter of subordination, or it is not always the matter that the people in government can fire judges. Maybe they don't fire judges, but they basically belong to the same group with judges. They're part of the same ruling elite. And this, of course, subverts judicial independence. So what you need, and now I'm moving on to share my screen finally, what you really need for the model, for the equilibrium to work, is you need roughly a judicial which is completely independent from government, and in the same time is independent from private interests. And that is a difficult thing to achieve, right? It's a difficult thing to achieve because even if a judicial is independent from government, it is really not so easy to have a judicial completely independent from all kind of vested interest groups, from the class groups, from various people who can bribe the judiciary, because in many countries the judiciary is poorly paid. Nevertheless, that is the historical condition, to have either control agencies. In Chile, for instance, it was a control agency, which was even more important than the judiciary. And it was also, this agency was created in the 30s. It is Chile's general controller, and it had in the same time the powers of an ombudsman, so people could in fact apply to it for redress if they suffered an injustice. It had powers of judicial review, so in other words they could veto legislation, which is extraordinarily powerful. And then their main mission came, and their main mission was auditing like the other agencies, but they were a very strong auditor, so they could also go to court to prosecute people whom they found culprits. And that, of course, is the ideal model. If anybody can, copy an institution, if this is free, I would recommend to look at the history of this extraordinary institution, the General Controller of Chile, which is largely accountable for the quality of the Chilean public sector accountability and administration. So they mattered more than the judiciary, but actually they're the same thing, right? So when I say, judicial and control independence, that means control bodies of the government which can be entirely independent. The other elements are completely different in constraints. They are basically the capacity of the society to inflict constraints. And those consist in free press and civil society. Now, why, in fact, the judicial independence is so important? Well, since I told you actually from the start, so that if corruption is norm, it's very difficult anyway to fight it on a judicial way. Well, it is very important in the current context because most of the work in the world on anti-corruption has very much relied in previous years on anti-corruption tools which require a well-functioning judiciary. So most of the recommendations that the countries received was to adopt typical anti-corruption legislation, conflict of interest legislation, criminal legislation outlawing bribery, for instance, whistleblower protection legislation, a lot of party finance control legislation. And a lot of this legislation, in fact, requires that the country already has rule of law and the country has an impartial and effective judiciary which is able to implement these tools. So in other words, for legal constraints to work, legal constraints require that you already have rule of law. And that is a situation in which many of the countries, of the 140 countries which presently confront systematic corruption, they just do not have presently, right? And as a consequence, these countries, obeyed this advice, and quite a lot of people adopted a lot of these indications. Many of them are in United Nations Convention Against Corruption, so it's actually in many ways an obligation to adopt all this heavy anti-corruption package. And what happens now is that we have this very quite strong correlation between the degree of corruption in the country and the public accountability and anti-corruption equipment that a country has. So the more corrupt a country is these days, the more rules it have. And this in itself is something which should make us think, because if we look at our Europam, we can see that societies which are higher on integrity are under-regulated on integrity. They are not over-regulated. So in other words, when adopting all this anti-corruption legislation, you have to start from the basic presumption, which is to ask, is anyone around who will implement this legislation? I mean, on the official side of implementers, is there anybody who is able to do this and willing to do this. Because if not, the adoption of all these tools will only reinforce this vicious correlation. Now, you can see in this chart a little bit of this evidence. You can see that in the past 15 years, actually, we had very, very few progress on control of corruption. The progress is represented by the bars which are on top of the horizontal chart. And you can see two small green bars. I recall you our code color. Green is good, red is bad. So you see a little bit of a tall column there, but it's not a tall column. This tall column, it's under 0.035 on a scale from 1 to 10, control of corruption, so it's not fabulous. But still, all this progress has happened in countries which already have rule of law. In other words, it happens in countries where already the judiciary and control agencies are autonomous from the government and from the people in government. And you can see that in countries which don't have rule of law, or in countries which are not free. So in other words, rule of law is completely out of question, because by definition, who is in government is above the law in these countries. In these countries, we only had regress. And these are the red columns which go underneath. And this also applies to the regulation, okay? I'm not insisting on this, but what you see here is that in Latin American countries, you see that party finance legislation, for instance, becomes effective only when the country has sufficient judicial independence. When it doesn't exist, party funding restrictions are really for nothing out there. Same applies to anti-corruption agencies. You see here a comparison of countries in the small table which have anti-corruption agencies against countries which don't. Right? So it's the same. Anti-corruption agencies can work well if the country has rule of law and very advanced judicial independence. The question is that in the very few countries which fulfill these conditions, well, those countries can do generally without anti-corruption agencies, just with some simple specialization of prosecutors. On the very famous Sicilian model of Judge Giovanni Falcone, he needed to specialize some prosecutors in corruption. But, it was enough to do that. They didn't need a separate agency in order to fight corruption. Anti-corruption agencies, if you do not have rule of law, and if the judiciary is not truly independent, are in fact a threat to rule of law, because they will be used, being very strong and being endowed with this very powerful anti-corruption legislation, they will be used against political opponents. And we have quite a lot of examples of this. So the problem with the judiciary is that the main question then is not what should we do if we would have this kind of judiciary. But in most countries we don't. We don't have independent control agencies. They are used for extortion from businesses, right? They are not actually used to control objectively, and we do not have independent judiciary. The judiciary is used to sentence political opponents. And then the real question is, what actually can be done in order to prompt the development of the judiciary? And of course, the secondary question is, what could civil society do about this? Right? Because who's trying to reform generally the judiciary? I mean, donors, people come from outside, international donors, and say you have to reform your judiciary. But of course, it is very difficult to reform other people's countries, right? Unless you fully occupy them. And as we have seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, even then it is quite a challenge. And civil societies, which have no power, all right? Civil societies expressing, concerns from society, want to improve the judiciary. So, how to do that, okay? Constitutional reforms, as I argued earlier, they're insufficient because they don't get implemented, right? And this is why we do not have a correlation between constitutional arrangements for an independent judiciary and a de facto independent judiciary. The correlation actually is negative, exactly as with anti-corruption legislation. The less independent a judiciary is, probably the more pages in the Constitution specifying in the judicial independence are. Now, if we look at what really happened in the past years, in the trends of independence of the judiciary that you will find in our forecast, you will find on our forecast country for 124 countries. What I show you here is just aggregated by continent. And what you see here is that, again, there is not much positive evolution out there. The only line where you see a little bit of progress is the gray line, Europe and Central Asia, and this is mostly on behalf of some countries in Southeastern Europe, which are in the process of European accession, and therefore they really improved a lot. Now, I who work in these countries and know them really well, I am really doubtful that a lot of these changes are very profound changes. But nevertheless, there are quite a lot of de jure reforms in countries like Macedonia, Montenegro, countries which have an interest to join EU. If you look for the rest, you will see that on all the continents, the end line is not above, the end point of the line is not above the starting point. In fact, in many cases, it's really underneath. So it is quite a challenge, and if this is a challenge, maybe it's not so easy to do. The reason why it's not so easy to do and why we should not perhaps waste so much resources in this is that reform of the judiciary is not a technical business. It's obviously a political process, as I was describing from the start. What you need is a government which no longer has very close ties with the judiciary, a government which is no longer in the situation to impose things to the judiciary, and in the end of the day, a government which does not want to control the judiciary anymore. The Estonian judicial reform was a very big success in the 90s. They closed all the judiciary for 6 months. They basically are the only really successful case of vetting of the whole judiciary. What they wanted is to replace the judiciary from the Soviet times with a new one. They hired only very young people or very old people, and the way it worked, they just appointed someone. They appointed someone who was a dissident, on whom there was absolute trust. He also appointed a few other people, like the equivalent of a Supreme Court, and from this group of people who were above, all good standards of integrity, they hired the rest of the judiciary. And since it's a small country, people accepted for 6 months that no, divorce, trials were heard until the judiciary was entirely reshuffled. But each time vetting was tried afterwards, it didn't work so well. And in fact, it only provided an opportunity for new political interventions in the judiciary. And why was that? Well, because this Estonian government of Mart Laar really wanted an independent judiciary. So that is actually the preliminary condition. You should think to invest in reform of the judiciary only if you satisfy this condition. Do you have these reformers who really are above suspicion that this is what they want, that they will really appoint the best people who have proven by their biographies that they are able to select others and to start vetting the judiciary? Then go ahead, do this judiciary reform. Otherwise, this is really not a technical business, and just investing in technical reforms when it's really a big political problem is not very helpful. There are 2 countries in the world, Brazil and Romania, which in the last 10 years had fabulous anti-corruption campaigns. They arrested ministers, they impeached presidents, they put a lot of people in jail. Now, obviously in the judiciary, these judiciaries have done some good things, and they should be the place where we look for lessons. Also, however, you will see that when we look for lessons, we will see that anti-corruption also strained a little bit rule of law in these countries. There was a lot of political contestation, there was a lot of partisanship, there were a lot of accusations. Nevertheless, what I meant to say is that on this 1 to 10 scale, Romania and Brazil, if you're going to look at this chart and you're going to see these 2 countries, you're going to see that, yes, they evolved in a landscape where you see that other countries actually regressed on judicial independence, but their whole evolution for this decade was very small. They evolved from somewhere between 5 and 6, for instance. So there is still quite a long way to go, even for these countries. And, this indicting people on top of politics is actually also a challenge. It is an important step, but it's also a challenge and has to be understood as this. So in fact, the question is, can you do something to help from civil society this reform of the judiciary? And what I have seen in these examples that I looked at, well, there is a successful case, the case of Taiwan. Again, you have to look over a very long interval of time to see what happened there. But there I have seen some clear evidence of civil society good intervention in the reform of the judiciary. But we are now talking civil society from within the judiciary. So in other words, who could help a lot are law schools. If law schools are not corrupt, law schools, even in countries where there is no rule of law, they can create debate circles, they can create think tanks. students' associations of students in law, they can start promoting standards, and they can start planning for the future when they will be the magistrates. So the new norm, this norm of independence, has to come from somewhere. If law schools, like a country I visited recently, are also corrupt, completely corrupt, both public law schools and private law schools are corrupt. If the bar association that you have is monopolistic and corrupt, then the judiciary cannot be better than that. So the way to help a judiciary reform is to create an alternative elite which wants to have a different judiciary. And this alternative elite has to come from within the judicial profession and from within the law universities and from the supporting civil society, right? More or less. I haven't seen this, in many countries, but the Taiwan example is documented on our website. So if you just click Taiwan, you will actually reach these papers which do the process tracing of Taiwan. Now, if you go to, if you wrap up all this legal constraints thing and you say, where does this legal constraints thing work and where did it work in recent countries, you actually come to the example of a country where I would consider there is not rule of law. Reformers come to government and are able to implement this top-down successful anti-corruption based on control in countries such as Rwanda. Rwanda had the most successful anti-corruption in Africa in the past 10 years. Roughly, this is based on exactly what we call a principal agent scheme. In other words, the person who is the boss really wants to clean the country of corruption. Of course, we are only talking about other people's corruption, right? Not the corruption of the party in government, not the corruption of the main clan. And therefore, it applies the simplest and clear-cut principal agent tools. Contracts, for instance, management contracts between the leader and people who are in charge of different public services. And very strong enforcement exists in countries like this. Not only you can lose your job, but you can really end up in jail because this is not a democratic country in Rwanda. But this works, and it brings quite a lot of advantages. So without having pluralism, without having freedom, you can actually achieve, to some extent, a good control of corruption within this paradigm. Now, in most countries, however, you do not have reformers coming to government, either Democrats or despots at all. And therefore, your corruption is what we call a collective action problem. And what does this mean? It basically means that now corruption is the norm. So most things more or less happen on the basis of connections, right? Or bribes. And most people are unable to change that. And how are they unable to change this? So first, people conform. If people just do what people around them do, that is the first collective action problem. Now, conformity and a lot of free riding. I'm not going to challenge this rule. It's going to be dangerous for me. It's absolutely understandable, by the way. And the second thing is that people do not unite. People do not join together to contest this norm in the name of the new one. They just don't associate. So very corrupt countries generally have very small number of associations, any sort of associations. If coalitions exist, they tend to be very formal coalitions, like coalitions of professional civil society around United Nations Convention for Corruption. That exists. Or again, professional civil society around open government partnership that also exists in quite a lot of countries. But then when my students look at these civil society organizations and when we very systematically try to answer the question, do countries who have civil societies of this kind implement more commitments than countries we don't, we find that it's not the case. Because again, this is not real, deep, widespread civil society, but very professional civil society which just clusters around these international commitments. Now, in order to see, how civil society could work, we really have to go to the countries which succeeded in building control of corruption, and that means going very far back in time to understand what is the mechanism by which civil society manages to deliver the goods. And I went back in my books even to these Italian city-states in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, because they had an excellent control of corruption in a time which was very similar to the context that we see today in some developing countries, in times where you could not rely on the autonomy of bureaucrats or the autonomy of judges. Basically, there were very few bureaucrats and judges. The state was absolutely very small, and when they existed, they were really employed by somebody. They were not employed by the community. So in other words, they were not autonomous. Nevertheless, this kind of states with very few resources manage, for instance, to put up very effective defense in a very dangerous world, defense for which they collected the money themselves, and they managed to organize this money. So in other words, they were really able to deliver the kind of collective goods that the governments do. And how did they do that, right? And there are a number of interesting solutions that one has to reflect on, presuming that this modernization simple paradigm that we all operate with would not work in the short time, may not even work in a long time. So maybe it is really not the solution to expect that people in government are going to be, the perfect German autonomous bureaucrats that Max Weber described in his works. That some countries have invested in these governments for many years. It's been numerous civil service trainings, and the civil service continues to be completely politicized and completely self-serving. In fact, it's serving whoever appoints them, and it's not serving the broader interest. But there are ways around that, and I think that this kind of solutions and ways around that have to be explored at least in an intermediate phase. What did this Italian city-state did, for instance? Well, they had a reciprocal oversight system. They didn't have control agencies, they didn't have anti-corruption agencies, but if a family was in charge of collecting taxes, and they had all these rotating positions, the positions were, somebody was in charge of that, and somebody else was in charge of controlling the first people. So first, this rotation was very good. People were only doing this as a civic duty. Whatever was to be done for government was done by some of these big families as a civic duty. Other people controlled on them. Services were paid, most of them, by fees. They were not paid by salaries. And then again, this was quite a good way of not turning the office into a permanent rent which can afterwards be sold to people. Audits were quite essential. In Venice, when the Doge finished his term, the new Doge would not take up his appointment without a full audit being realized. Mayors were like what we would call today, were like city managers in Italy, was the podesta, and the podesta was not even paid until his audit was done, and then everything which was considered that was his fault was deducted, and he was paid only after that. That means that he had to have an initial capital by which to come to his office. And this is how it worked. He had a capital, he has his own law enforcement officers, he came with his whole staff. He was like a private contractor in charge of managing the city. And the reasons why Italians reached this solution is that they considered that the groups in the city were very factional and they were not able to govern the city with objectivity, that everybody would have governed the city in their own interest, and therefore they had created this outside position, somebody who would come and would be in charge of all that, of law enforcement, of judging cases, of collecting taxes, and that people would come with their stuff and with their capital and would only be reimbursed at the end of their term. And it was a very short term. It was generally 1 year. It was also this very good regulation, for instance, in Genoese colonies, that the governor, the new governor, would have to, the day when he came, the former governor had to leave by the same ship, so that they are unable to pass to one another the contacts and whatever bad things were going on. Fairly far from the way things are organized today, but that's not so far when we think of certain public organizations, which are not necessarily the top government and which could have some sort of similar designs. Now, what do we do in order to decide what kind of approach do we have in anti-corruption, considering civil society? Well, we have basically three situations. In situation number one, you have quite a lot of losers of corruption, and some of these losers are autonomous enough. There are, the people, my enlightened citizens, e-citizens. They are people who have internet connections, who have a job, and if you have enough people like this, all right, then you can definitely do a strategy to build up very strong demand for good governance, and this is what you should do. You have people with no political will, you should simply chase these people from government. And there are countries where this happened. I organized in Romania this coalition for a clean parliament, which simply chased the government, which had 20% advantage in poll, but it worked. There is this quite great example that I promote from Monterrey in Mexico, where civil society was able to put a very strong coalition in order to change the governor. They elected a reform-minded government. The reform-minded government formed a body with them, a committee, a governance body joined with civil society, and in particular this very strong business association. And together they proceeded to clean the police. The police was completely infiltrated by the drug cartel and corrupt, and they vetted the police in the same way that Estonia vetted the judiciary. For 6 months in Monterrey, they vetted the entire police. The business associations pulled together their human resource office's efforts, and on their own money, on their own funds, basically they assessed all the policemen, they recruited, and they trained new one. Private sector did this. And the reason why the private sector was in the position to do this is that other types of NGOs, other types of community groups, Facebook groups had created this very big coalition which created the two enabling conditions. The replacement of the governor and the creation of this joint body between government, civil society, private sector, which was then able to reshuffle the police. And immediately you can see that crime figures went down, and this was quite a big success. So you can do that, but definitely you need quite a strong civil society to do this. When you have it, when you have the elements of this, of course, go for it. Put everyone into a grand coalition, a specialized coalition where everybody knows what they do best. Some people communicate, other people, offer their human resources, as the businesses in Monterrey did. In my own coalition, we had, lawyers who would defend us, journalists who would disseminate us, and people who were, closer to political parties would negotiate with the political parties and created these blacklists to prevent them to put corrupt candidates on lists in elections. And this worked. This protected us fairly well and really was a turn for the country. Now this is a good situation, however. You have a second situation, which is fairly frequent. You have losers from corruption, but these losers are not autonomous enough for action. Or you may be that people don't perceive themselves to be losers. In Peru, I heard that many people being in the informal sector, they say, well, but I'm in the informal sector. Even if they steal from government money, they don't steal from me because I don't pay any taxes to the budget, right? So you may have this second situation where, in fact, you don't have enough losers, or losers are not autonomous enough. Well, what you have to do, the only sensible and really sustainable thing to do here on anti-corruption is to build up this civil society capacity. So investing in civil society, putting internet connections to these people, helping these people move from vulnerable employment to real employment, giving land to these people. You will discover, the South Korea example also on our website, splendidly written by a South Korean scholar, showing that this was the beginning of the virtuous circle in South Korea. It was a land reform which created a huge land middle class who were then able to send their children into education. So you have to build civil society. And this was done. In fact, it was even done by donors. The South Korean example, it's one of the successful post-war American examples of helping other countries reach good control of corruption. Now I arrived to the really bad situation, which situation C, where in fact you don't seem to have many losers. There is a lot of corruption in the country. There are notorious countries which, for instance, buy Olympics or soccer games, but you don't seem to have, domestically people who suffer a lot. These are countries which generally have important mineral revenues from mineral resources. They have few numbers of citizens, they rely on foreign workers, and they give very big privileges to everyone who's a citizen. So despite the fact that the country is corrupt, people don't care, because if the government pays your rent for your whole life, if the government pays your education, then you really see the good side of particularism. And I completely, recommend that nothing should be done in this country, in particular from outsiders or from the small groups in universities. When most people in a country actually perceive that they win out of corruption, it's only, an extraordinary external circumstance which could change something. And we have a country in Europe actually where this happened. This country is Malta. Malta seems to have reached quite important degrees of corruption in recent years. In the same time, it enjoyed the highest trust of government in Europe. This situation has radically changed in 2 years. Now there is awareness of organized crime infiltration on top of government, and now in the last Eurobarometer of yesterday, you can see that the Maltese started to be more critical. But they had so much money, the country was so flourishing in this interval due to EU funds, that despite the fact that they knew that at the top it was grand corruption, they also benefited individually. It's a small country, an island. And therefore, 1 year ago or 2 years ago, despite very strong evidence, people really were not very moved by that. But something important happened in Malta, and this is Brussels happened in Malta. You had important European constraints. But this doesn't apply to many countries in the world. Very few countries in the world have the equivalent of a strong European Union, which would intervene and say, you are now a member, you have to behave by the rules in the group. Now, how do we assess more on a sector? Okay, so this was like the general assessment on a country to do anti-corruption agency, but we have to do the same within every sector. We have to understand a little bit who wins and who loses out of corruption. And what we do is that we apply this very simple scheme. You see it here applying to a problem from Mexico, to a corrupt union leader in Mexico, who's actually very famous in Mexico. It's a person who was for many years in charge of an education union, the union of school teachers. But in the same time, she has a yacht, she has a mansion in California, all her deputies drove Hummer cars, and a lot of the positions in this union and in the schools actually were basically sold or inherited through families. And she was a very powerful political character, because having this bloc union, she negotiated each time when elections were on, the bloc of voters that she controlled through this union, through this extraordinary benefits that she would give and the control she had by selling positions. She basically negotiated votes for the president. And when you have a bloc of 1 million and something voters, then you indeed are very powerful and above the law. And in the end, it was really proven that she was rather above the law. But you ask yourself when you look at this problem, you say, how is this possible? I mean, this is a very big country, why didn't the parents do something? Because if you have such a corrupt education system where teachers actually inherit positions, then the quality of the education mustn't be very good, right? And there are a number of answers to that. But what I want to show to you is simply on how to put this, to explain why this person survived so much, by this very simple tool. So we look a little bit who stood to gain from this situation, a lot, for whom this problem was very important, had a very big stake, right? And for who actually was in the position to change something. And these are the people whom we put in box A, where these two lines, the line of influence and the line of impact, meet. And the person who had the highest stakes and the highest powers were the union leaders, like her, were the parties who got their votes, and were the unionized teachers who had all these privileges. In other words, people who without much qualification had managed to buy a position in and be in this situation. And of course, they were against any change. This is what we call the status quo winners. Then we had losers. We had pupils who complained with the education, but those losers had less influence on the influence scale, even if on the impact they were quite high up. You had other teachers who were not unionized. You had people in private schools. You have parents, and you had some political challengers, people who were weaker parties who had never negotiated or were not in the position to get votes. Then you have some people who are completely indifferent to the situation. These are people who rank as impact very low. They are in box C, but who can be very influential. And who can they be? A very strong moderator, a talk show host on TV, for instance, or a sportsman, or some rock star, in the country, who is someone who's not interested in this question, but has a huge reputation, and these people could actually move people if he or she would decide to speak up on this problem. Generally, people in civil society and journalists and business, we rank them between these two categories. We said that some of them are actually quite strong enough, but of course they are not directly involved. So the importance, the influence, that they have might be reasonably okay, but the impact for them is very low. So what do we have to do? what we have to do is to try to recruit and put together a coalition out of the people who are losers and people who are altruists. And this coalition has to change this very, very powerful book from box A. But now I'm not gonna lie to you. I mean, if the problem looks like the one you see here, with everyone who cares is also the people who are most powerful, then the problem does not get solved. And this problem didn't get solved. This person was indicted, but in the end she managed to walk. But the lesson is that you can try to break out these groups, you know. Let's say not all politicians are in box A. There are always people who want to win elections, opponents. Try to get some of these opponents into your coalition. There is the church, you know. Sometimes the church leaders can also be attracted, as it happened, although very late, in Italy, in the anti-mafia movement. Try to attract the church. Try to get some celebrities. Celebrities who would speak up, celebrities who would put up a video clip on the corruption problem and would help your coalition. They would become the public image of their coalition. They can change a lot. So get in some altruists. But the thing is that you have to organize this resistance across these groups. And you can make an assessment on the sectors, and you would very fast understand what are the sectors with a potential to do something and what are the sectors where it's really very complicated. But the thing is that it's very difficult for any sector to change unless there is this very broad civil society alliance around the sector. One shortcut and good news that we have is that, in fact, technology can help a lot. And there are ways of shortcutting these collective action problems that I just described and this big effort in building coalitions by using technologies. How are these technologies working? You know, I mean, you can have a coalition just to look at financial disclosures at politicians. You can have, and that I think is best, you can organize this kind of feedback systems to public services. And this should not be organized by government. I mean, of course, it's wonderful if government cooperates in this, but it's never good that they're organized by government alone. What you would have to have is some civil society coalition which jointly with government creates a system to rate government services. And these systems, you know, I mean, the same way it works in the private sector. If I rent a car, for instance, from a ride-sharing scheme in Berlin on the street, when I leave the car, I will have a feedback form. And on this feedback form, if I found the car dirty, I will tell them this car was dirty. And in the next moment, I will see how the car disappears from the software. So nobody will be able to rent this car anymore because somebody will be sent to service the car, to clean the car before the next customer comes in. So in the same way that we were able to use technology for Uber to become such a global success, or for this ride-sharing scheme, or for TripAdvisors, where we all contribute to tell other people, in the same way we can exploit and innovate with these digital schemes in order to give feedback to government, but immediately say, do not go to this office. In this office you will have to pay a bribe. Do not go to this office, it'll take you 50 days, they'll ask you more papers than necessary, all right? We have to organize systems like this. And this is something that business, civil society can do in cooperation with the government. Now, the next element of civil society which matters, of course, is the media. And the media would seem to be a very simple affair, but it's not, because in corrupt countries, media tends to be corrupt as well. Corrupt media cooperates with the government. You all identify this figure from House of Cards, right? It's the person who, in fact, instead of reporting, she actually creates news, right? She works for a politician more than she works for her readers. And this is the situation that we have in many such countries. But this doesn't mean that nothing can be done. And in fact, I have here quite a short list of solutions to have in media. And solution number one in media is that you must have at least a part of media which is clean. Now, how can you do that? Well, these days it's not so complicated because you can have alternative media through internet. Alternative media also has to survive, and therefore, you know, you probably would have to support it by crowdfunding, or you will have to get a donor, but this works. Right? So you can presume that you will always have two medias in corrupt countries. One will be the mainstream corrupt media, and this corrupt media will in fact be fake news at a giant scale and faked interpretations. And you will have a smaller clean media, the media for integrity. And this media for integrity really is what's supporting by donors, for instance, by trying to find clean investment in media, because anti-corruption media doesn't really have a very good business model. You won't find clean advertisers, for instance, to risk advertising in media which publishes controversial things and which attacks the government. So in other words, I think that this is a neglected area by donors, where donors should help civil society a lot. Money is needed to help this corner of media, which are always going to be marginal, the pro-integrity media in corrupt countries. So, in short, to increase constraints, you have to have this support for the independence of the judiciary, and in particular, as I said, you have to have some civil society within the judiciary which promotes a new model. You have to support free and clean media, and of course you have to have e-citizens, and in particular I recommend this consumer surveys. In what order to do all this? That is also, a question. Well, the simple answer is that you first have to start by any kind of assessment. The national assessment, the sector assessment, you have to assess the human resources that you have. You have to do the kind of stakeholder assessment that I showed you to see who actually wants to credibly change the situation in that area. Right? You see here the example of Senegal. You have the assessment of Senegal. The assessment of Senegal is very simple and rudimentary, comes from IPI. You see that this country is doing, on the world average on judicial independence, is doing on the world average on administrative burden, is basically doing on the world average on everything, and in Africa is one of the few cases which show some progress in perception indicators, but it's really very low on e-citizenship. It is very down on e-citizenship. In other words, there is insufficient demand for good governance. And insufficient demand with good governance, despite the fact that this country adopted all possible anti-corruption bodies and all possible anti-corruption legislation, the delivery is just not yet there. So what we should do is support civil society, support the digitalization of this society in Senegal. This is more or less what should happen. I will end here with this short list of things to do on constraints, and thank you for your patience.